Richard, Eleanor, and Emily Pierce seemed like the perfect family living in the peaceful town of Maple Falls, until one day, all three were found brutally murdered inside their own home, each death more chilling and mysterious than the last. What happened behind closed doors was far darker than anyone could have imagined, and the truth would unravel a twisted secret that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Maple Falls was the kind of town that looked like it belonged on a postcard. With its tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and old-fashioned charm, it gave the impression that nothing bad could ever happen there. People left their doors unlocked. Children played outside until sunset. It was a place where crime was something you only saw on television. But all of that changed one quiet summer morning in August 2014. It started with a call to 911. A concerned neighbor had noticed the Pierce family's mail piling up and lights on at odd hours. No one had seen any of them in days. The police arrived, expecting something simple. Maybe a family had gone on vacation without telling anyone. Instead, they walked into one of the most disturbing crime scenes the state had ever seen. Inside the Pierce house, everything was eerily clean and silent. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then the officers found the bodies. Richard Pierce, a local accountant known for his polite manner and quiet lifestyle, was discovered in the kitchen, slumped over the table, a knife wound to his chest. His wife, Elena, a retired art teacher, was found in the upstairs bathroom, fully dressed and drowned in the tub. Their daughter, Emily, a straight-A high school senior, was lying in her bedroom with a pillow over her face and bruises on her neck. Each body had been left carefully arranged. Each room was undisturbed, and next to each victim lay a single white rose, fresh and unblemished. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. There was no clear motive. It looked less like a robbery or a domestic incident and more like a ritual. The local police immediately called in state investigators, realizing the case was far more complex than anything they were equipped to handle. The media descended on the town within hours. Reporters interviewed anyone who had ever spoken to the family. What they found didn't make things any clearer. Everyone had the same thing to say. The Pierces were normal, quiet, kind, private, but not suspicious. They didn't host parties. They didn't argue loudly. They weren't involved in any legal trouble or conflicts. No one could recall a single incident that might hint at danger. What made the case even more unsettling was the precision of the murders. Each one was different: stabbing, drowning, suffocation, yet none showed signs of struggle. It was as if the victims had either trusted their killer or been caught completely off guard. And those roses, left like calling cards, sent a chill through every investigator on the case. It was the kind of detail you'd expect in a movie, not a real crime scene. With no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, and no immediate suspects, the town began to panic. Rumors of a serial killer spread fast. Parents kept their children indoors. Businesses started closing early. Maple Falls, once peaceful and safe, had become a town frozen in fear. And then, during a routine second sweep of the house, an officer noticed something odd in the attic. A small panel in the ceiling had been disturbed. Behind it was a dusty, sealed metal box, one that would change everything investigators thought they knew about the case. The metal box found in the attic of the Pierce home was old, rusted around the edges, and secured with a heavy padlock. Investigators had no idea what they'd find inside. When they finally forced it open, what they discovered turned the investigation on its head. Inside the box was a disturbing collection of materials. There were photographs, dozens of them, most in black and white, some appearing to be decades old. Many were portraits of children, all of them unsmiling and staring directly into the camera. Others showed groups of people in strange outdoor settings, standing in circles or facing away from the lens. A few were marked with red X's. There were also maps of nearby towns, each one annotated with hand-drawn symbols and dates. Then came the clippings, newspaper articles reporting missing persons cases, most of them unsolved, and most involving children or teenagers. But the most chilling discovery was a stack of handwritten pages. The papers were covered in childish handwriting, uneven, full of spelling errors, and written with disturbing detail. The entries read like diary pages, But they weren't accounts of everyday life. They were filled with dark fantasies, graphic descriptions of violence, and references to something called the White Rose Order. The writings spoke of purity, sacrifice, and something referred to repeatedly as the ritual of selection. The tone was obsessive, detached, and frighteningly methodical. Each page seemed to fixate on the idea of perfection. There were statements like, "Only the chosen should remain," and "Weakness must be erased." There were lists of names, some crossed out, others underlined, all written with the same deliberate script. Toward the end of the stack, one name had a red circle around it, Emily Pierce, and underneath it in shaky capital letters the word "completed." The presence of Emily's name, along with the crossed-out names and coded references to death, immediately raised alarms. Investigators began comparing the listed names to the missing persons reports from the clippings. To their shock, several matched. It wasn't just a list of random names, it was a log. Someone had been tracking victims, someone had been planning. This for years. Forensics experts were called in to examine the materials. Initial tests revealed something no one had expected. The DNA on the pages did not match Richard, Elena, or Emily Pierce. It belonged to a fourth person, previously unknown to the investigation. When they ran the DNA through old hospital records and genealogical databases, they made a discovery that deepened the mystery. Richard and Eleanor had another child, a son, named Nathaniel, born 3 years before Emily. His name had never come up during interviews, and his existence was not common knowledge. According to medical records, Nathaniel had been placed in a long-term behavioral institution at the age of 9. There were no public details about why. The facility itself, known as St. Calix, had since closed down due to legal trouble and multiple accusations of abuse. Nathaniel had been discharged at 15, and then he had vanished. Now investigators were left with more questions than answers. Who was Nathaniel Pierce? Why had his parents hidden him from the world? And what exactly was the White Rose? Order? One thing was certain, this was no ordinary family. And the murders weren't random, they were part of something much darker. The search for Nathaniel Pierce became the new priority. Investigators pored over old records, medical files, and school documents, but the trail was cold. After he left the behavioral facility, there were no employment records, no drivers, license applications, no credit activity, nothing to indicate where he had gone or what had become of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But one thing was clear. If he was alive, he was no longer Nathaniel Pierce. A breakthrough came when one officer made a connection between Nathaniel's known fingerprints and a minor background check from a neighboring county. The prints matched a man arrested 5 years earlier for trespassing on private property. At the time, he gave the name Ethan Cross and claimed to be a freelance photographer. He was released without charges. No one had thought much of it. But now, with the DNA match and the violent Pierce murders, it became clear that Ethan Cross was not just a drifter. He was the missing son. Further investigation revealed that Ethan Cross had been living under the radar for years. He rented a small house on the outskirts of a town just 30 miles from Maple Falls. He worked part-time at a funeral home and was known by his co-workers as quiet, polite, and private. People described him as the kind of man who kept to himself, didn't ask questions, and never caused trouble. He paid his rent in cash and didn't own a car. He used a prepaid phone and avoided social gatherings. Detectives obtained a warrant and searched his residence. On the surface, it was ordinary, neat, sparsely decorated with little sign of personality. But a hidden door in the basement revealed the truth. Behind a bookshelf was a stairway leading to a locked room. Inside was a space that could only be described as a shrine to obsession. The walls were covered with photographs, candid shots of the Pierce family and other people investigators hadn't yet identified. There were notes scribbled in the same shaky handwriting as the attic pages. Diagrams of houses, school schedules, and maps were pinned to corkboards. There were medical books stacked along one wall and shelves filled with bottles labeled with chemical names. There were jars containing preserved insects' feathers and, in one case, what appeared to be human hair. Most disturbing of all were the journals. Dozens of notebooks filled with meticulous entries detailing routines, behavioral observations, and increasingly violent ideations. One passage described the night of the Pierce murders in chilling clarity, written with a sense of detachment that made investigators' blood run cold. Nathaniel had not just planned the killings, he had rehearsed them. He saw himself as an instrument of justice, fulfilling a sacred duty inherited from his parents. It became clear that the murders were not an isolated act of rage. They were the result of years of planning, conditioning, and a deeply warped belief system. Nathaniel hadn't just come back to kill his family, he came to complete what he believed was a mission, the order, the rituals, the roses. It was all part of a legacy he felt bound to continue. And now, it seemed, he was only getting started. The basement room discovered beneath Ethan Cross's home was more than just a hideaway. It was a disturbing archive of a mind consumed by control and ideology. Investigators spent days cataloging everything inside. The evidence revealed a man who had not only been hiding in plain sight, but who had been preparing for something far greater than a single crime. Each journal, each item on the wall, pointed to a long-term, deeply calculated agenda rooted in a twisted set of beliefs that Nathaniel Pierce had been carrying since childhood. The writings in the journals painted a picture of psychological conditioning that began early. Nathaniel referred to his upbringing not as a childhood, but as a training ground. He described being taught about cleansing weakness, about compliance through silence, and about maintaining the bloodline. There were references to what he called the experiment, which investigators came to understand was a series of behavioral trials his parents had subjected him to in secret. These included long periods of isolation, forced fasting, sleep deprivation, and emotional detachment, all conducted under the guise of achieving mental purity. Richard and Elena Pierce, who the public had viewed as quiet, loving parents, were, in truth, once members of a clandestine cult that operated during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Known to its members as the White Rose Order, the group's core belief was that society had been corrupted by emotional vulnerability and mental weakness. They preached the idea that only the clean of mind and heart should shape the future. Though the cult never gained much public notoriety, it had gathered small, tightly knit communities of followers across the state. Eventually, law enforcement disbanded the group after several members were linked to illegal experiments on children and one unproven case of ritualistic abuse. Richard and Elena, fearing legal consequences, withdrew from the group and went into hiding under new identities. They changed towns, changed professions, and started over as a respectable middle-class family. But according to Nathaniel's journals, they had already damaged him beyond repair. He believed they had abandoned their cause, and in doing so, had betrayed everything they had taught him. The journals also revealed that Nathaniel viewed the murders of his family not as punishment, but as elevation. He wrote about releasing them from corruption and cleansing the original bloodline. He described Emily, his sister, as untainted but distracted, someone who might have been a worthy heir if she had not been infected by modern ideals. His parents, on the other hand, he saw as hypocrites, teachers who had strayed from their own gospel. Their deaths, in his eyes, were acts of loyalty to the original doctrine. Even more horrifying was the final section of his writings. Nathaniel had created profiles on other families in the region, carefully studying their habits, schedules, and social behaviors. He had identified what he believed were weakened bloodlines and candidates for purging. He listed addresses, planned dates, escape routes. The Pierce murders, it turned out, were not a spontaneous eruption of violence. They were the first stage of something far more sinister. Nathaniel wasn't acting alone either. One journal entry hinted at contact with other former cult members. He referred to them only by initials, but noted meetings and coded communications. Investigators realized they might be dealing with the reawakening of a group long thought defunct. A group that believed Nathaniel was a chosen successor. The past had never truly ended. It had just been waiting. Nathaniel Pierce was arrested without resistance. When officers arrived at his home in the early hours of the morning, he answered the door calmly, as if he had been expecting them. He offered no excuses, no emotion, and no denial. He was taken into custody, read his rights, and escorted away while neighbors watched in stunned silence. Most had never suspected that the quiet man working at the funeral home just down the road had a dark past, or that he was responsible for one of the most horrifying crimes the state had ever seen. At the police station, Nathaniel remained emotionless throughout the interrogation. He admitted to the murders in a flat, clinical tone, explaining each detail as if reciting instructions from a manual. He described how he had spent months preparing, watching the Pierce household, memorizing their routines, and choosing the exact methods for each killing based on what he considered their individual weaknesses. His goal, he explained, was not revenge but completion. He spoke about the doctrine of the White Rose Order with an eerie reverence, stating that he had done what had to be done in order to honor the legacy of purity. The details were so methodical, so calculated, that even the most seasoned investigators were disturbed. Nathaniel's lack of remorse was chilling, but what truly terrified the task force was the growing realization that he might not be the only one left who believed in the cult's teachings. Hidden within one of his final journals was a coded ledger, lists of initials, meeting locations, dates, and obscure references to future plans. While no other names were written in full, the implications were clear. There were others, and they had not forgotten their cause. Using this information, investigators launched a broader investigation across 3 states. Locations mentioned in Nathaniel's writings were searched, and what they found stunned the entire task force. In the woods outside a rural property listed in his notes, officers discovered a series of shallow graves. Each one contained human remains, some dating back nearly a decade. Just like at the Pierce home, a single white rose had been left at each burial site. DNA analysis linked several of the victims to cold cases, many of which had never been solved or had been dismissed as runaways. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Nathaniel had been active far longer than anyone had realized. The Pierce murders were not his first act, but his most personal. He had been operating under aliases, moving through towns, studying families, and quietly selecting victims based on his warped ideology. His life had been consumed by this mission. He believed he was a savior, cleansing society of invisible flaws only he could see. At trial, Nathaniel remained stone-faced. When asked if he felt guilt, he replied that guilt was a distraction of the unworthy. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without parole, but even with him behind bars, the fear lingered. The journal suggested others were still out there, watching, waiting, and believing. The White Rose Order, once thought to be a relic of the past, had not died. It had simply gone underground, leaving authorities with a haunting question: was this the end or just the beginning?